Brett, the herbalist, and we're back with another episode of Secrets of Herbal Healing. And today we're talking about conquering Candida and thrush. And what I'm going to do is share some of the statistics around Candida, the types of Candida, how it affects you, what the symptoms are, and how it gets into the body, and what the underlying situation is that allows us to get a Candida infestation. And I'm sure you're going to get some new and interesting information. It's my job to simplify complicated things down into everyday terms so that you can use them yourself. All right, so we'll get into it shortly. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. There's a barcode, QR code in the top corner there. If you scan that, you'll go to the page and you can follow along, and you can also dig into some of the deep information. So let's just share screen and we'll talk through it. So this is a picture of the Candida yeast is what it is. It's a type of fungus, and it grows on the body. It's always on our body and in our bodies, in the gut and on the skin. But what we're going to talk about is what happens when it gets out of control. And it's one of those things that you hear about commonly as thrush or Candida. But it's quite surprising, some of the facts and statistics around this, which might surprise you. So I'll share some of those first. Then we'll go into the types, the symptoms, and the underlying causes. Next week, we'll get into how you can deal with Candida and thrush outbreaks and prevent them with food and herbs. But yeah, some of the shocking statistics. 25% of sick people admitted to hospital with Candida die during hospitalization. 25%. And it's not known exactly if Candida is the cause of death or if they die with Candida, but Candida is a factor in these hospitalizations and deaths. It's estimated also at 995,000. So this is nearly 1 million people die annually from Candida bloodstream infections. And we'll talk about this a bit further down the page. And recently, during COVID-19, there was a dramatic increase in deaths of people with Candida of 50 to 60%. So it was a very clear factor in the deaths from COVID. So I thought that was very interesting. And one of the reasons for that also is that these Candida yeasts are in the hospitals. And so they can be picked up in the hospitals as well and get into the lungs. And so they're very, very virulent and dangerous for mortality. So there's a lot of deaths from Candida. And this is something that we don't often talk about or think about. So Candida is a parasitic fungus. It's a type of fungus, and it's in the fungus family, but it's actually a yeast. So it's sort of a yeast within the fungal family, if that makes sense, within the fungal kingdom. They're single-celled organisms, so a bit like bacteria, a single-cellular organism, and they multiply quite rapidly. So we'll talk about how this multiplication happens and how they infect the body a little bit further on. It's a little bit difficult to diagnose because you can't get a blood test for Candida. The only way they can really pick it up is by getting it on a slide in a microscopic environment and actually seeing it on a slide, the Candida itself. And you'll get to see what that looks like a little bit further down as well. So that's one of the things with Candida. It's very, very hard to pick up unless it's really obvious, the symptoms, and we'll talk about those too. So here's a picture of some Candida, the single cells, and infecting. This is the layer of the skin. And so you can see them getting in through the skin. And this is how they get into the body, through the skin or through the mucous membranes. What we're probably most familiar with is thrush infections, what we call thrush, which is Candida externally. And the most common one is obviously the genital thrush. And we'll talk about that a bit further as well. But there are over 600 species of disease-causing fungi in the world that infect humans, but there's 20 species of Candida. And we're just going to talk about the top half a dozen, the most common ones, because this is just too much and too many to talk about in depth. Yeah, what we're most familiar with is the thrush or the oral candida and the genital candida. So these are some of the species, and we'll go into each one of these types a little bit more as we go down. But these are the most common species. The most common of all is Candida albicans, 65%, Candida glabrata, 11%, Candida tropicalis, 7%, parasitic, 6%, and Candida krusei, 2.4%. But this is an interesting one. Candida auris has been on the rise, and it's been called a superbug. So that's the one that's in the hospitals, and that can be lethal. And that's the one that gets into the blood. And up to 95% of Candida bloodstream infections are caused by albicans, glabrata, Phylosis tropicalis, and krusei. But this auris, this is the one that's on the rise. This is the new scary one. So let's look at the different types of Candida or thrush. Most common is the two types, the genital and the oral. So we'll talk about those first of all. This is the oral and esophageal. As you can see, this is on the tongue. It looks like this sort of like white coating on the tongue. And you get symptoms of redness and soreness, difficulty swallowing, cracking at the corners of the mouth. So that's a fairly obvious sign. Then with the genital one, similar signs there. Look at this number, 75% of women will suffer with it at least once. It's quite common with women in particular. Men can get it as well on the genitals. And the common symptoms are redness, itchy, burning, and with women, a discharge. And it's called like a cottage cheesy type discharge. And I think this but is a similar thing that happens on men as well. But the itching and burning is a pretty obvious sign that there's Candida going on. Then we've got the skin Candida. And as we showed above on the picture, how it can get through the skin and into the skin and infect the skin. And interesting number here, 75,000 hospitalizations. This is the broader fungal skin diseases, of which Candida is one. Candida is not the most common fungal skin disease. It's more of a rare one. But it happens, you'll know if it's happening in the skin folds where it's moist and warm and you get that burning, itching, terrible burning, itching feeling. And then there's the nails. So it can infect the nails. I think most commonly the toenails where it's damp and moist. That can affect 3 to 12% of the population. Again, it's not the most common fungal problem on the nails, but it is one that can happen. This is probably the most scary one, the invasive candidas, the candidiasis. So this is when it gets into the blood. It's called candidemia. And you can see here, there's little spores, the little round dots there. Those are the little single-celled fungi. But then what it develops is these little extensions on here. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but this is the thread-like extensions, and that's what it uses to penetrate and get into things. And here's a scary number here. Cases estimated from 250,000 to 700,000 in the United States, and globally annually about 1 million deaths from invasive candidiasis or candidemia. So quite frightening when you think about it. It can get into other parts of the body, the heart, the brain, eyes, bones. So right throughout the body, and it puts these little threads in, and that's how it penetrates. So we'll look at that a little bit further down the page as well. So here are some of the symptoms of these most common types. We've talked about a little bit already. Basically redness, soreness, itching, cracking of the skin, lesions start to appear. There's the cottage cheese-like discharge from the genital area. Itching mainly on the skin, that'll be the most obvious sign. Patches and swelling, skin cracking, nails becoming thick and brittle, pain, inflammation. And when you've got the invasive candidiasis, which is in the blood, then you get this fever. And this is a fever with no other reason, like no other obvious cause, no virus or bacterial cause that you can find. then it does point to candidiasis. But again, you'd have to get it checked and looked at under a microscope to get it diagnosed properly. So if you've got mysterious symptoms that you don't know what it is, that can be candidiasis. And another thing that Candida will do is it'll cause this insatiable hunger for sugar because it thrives on sugar. So just another symptom that you might get. And here's how it happens. So the main part of the cell is this circular part here, the yeast itself. And what it does when it comes into contact with the skin is it's triggered to produce this little hypha, which is what they call this tail that comes off it. And that penetrates into the skin and it starts to feed. So it's a bit like, I guess you'd call it like a parasitic, like a mosquito almost, going in through the skin membrane, through the dermis, and feeding off the nutrients in the skin. And so here it is here, feeding off the nutrients in the skin. And there's some of the chemical processes that it needs to, that it goes through to feed on the nutrients inside the skin cells. And so it's this tail, this penetrating tail, that's the problem, because it can get into various cells in the body. And it's the mutation or the hypha, the morphism, they call it, is triggered by contact with the skin. So what we're going to do now is just talk about some of the things that predetermine how this can happen and why this would happen, what allows this adhesion to take place and this penetration, what encourages it. And this is another thing worth mentioning, that it forms a biofilm. So it's sort of basically protecting itself by forming a film so that it can continue to do what it does and feed off the organism, or feed off us, basically. So here's some of the underlying symptoms, not symptoms, precursors or factors, underlying factors that encourage the Candida infestation. One of them is inflammation, acid balance, sugar intake, immune function, and the good and bad fat ratio. So what I'm going to do now is just go quickly through each of those so you can get a bit more an understanding. So with inflammation, what happens is when you've got inflammation, the membranes tend to swell up and it decreases the integrity of the membrane. So it compromises the skin, the dermal layer on the skin, or the internal epithelial layer inside your body. And that basically allows the Candida to get into the skin and penetrate with its little hypha. So inflammation is quite a problem. They've found a lot of people that have inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's disease or irritable bowel are far more likely to get a Candida infestation. And of course, when you've had an ongoing inflammatory problem, then it spills over into the skin on your body as well. And so the same thing applies there. Acidity. So it's well established that Candida does respond to a more acidic environment. So, and they've established with studies that when there's a neutral or an alkaline pH, that the Candida won't survive in that environment. And so although there's arguments around whether your body can become acidic or not, it's well established that your tissues can become affected by acid and the pH can become acidic. And so that's when Candida is basically given an open invitation. So if you've got an acidic environment and an inflamed environment, you're asking for Candida to thrive. And the thing to know about this, to remember about this, is Candida is always on our bodies. It's always in our gut, and it's always on our skin. It's always there, but it's kept under control by the environment, the healthy environment. So inflammation and acidity, when we're a bit off balance, Candida will take advantage of that. So one of the common treatments for Candida is to starve it of sugar, because it's a yeast, and yeast loves sugar. As you know, if you've sort of fermented anything, basically that's what takes place. The organisms thrive in a sugar-rich environment. So it's been shown that reducing sugar dramatically reduces Candida. And so a classic Candida diet would be avoiding all processed sugar, processed carbs, simple sugars, and that would help to starve the Candida. And then we've got boosting your immune system. So this is also really important because we know that 80% of our immune cells, our immune system, operates from within the gut. And so a common known reason for getting a Candida outbreak is having taken a course of antibiotics, because the antibiotics destroy the good bacteria, the good cells, the good microbiome, and that it opens up a whole lot of parking spaces for Candida to hop into, and that'll take full advantage of that. And this is an interesting fact here. Candida can cause life-threatening infections in immunocompromised patients. So getting through the gut wall into the blood. So good thing to remember. And here's the fats. Obviously, having a lot of trans fats or a lot of processed fats or fried foods, even a whole lot of saturated fats and animal fats and meaty products can cause a lot of acid in your body, a lot of inflammation. So that goes without saying that would contribute to a bad environment, which would allow Candida to thrive. But also the good fats have the opposite effect, actually inhibit Candida. So, and coconut oil is one I'd suggest, and coconut cream is quite often very good for inflammatory bowel disease, and it's also known to reduce Candida in the gut. So worth remembering that good fats can be really beneficial. Coconut oil is good for your immune system as well, so secondary benefit there. So well worth looking at. And just last point I thought I'd make today is the scary numbers that I gave you at the beginning about Candida, killing 1 million people a year, which is quite frightening. Those people are quite often already sick with something else. They're quite often going into hospital and picking up more Candida that's circulating, the superbug type that's circulating in the hospitals, getting an infection in the blood, being given lots of antibiotics, having poor diet and poor food intake while they're in hospital. And all of these things contribute. So they're already in a they've met all the prerequisites before they even get to being in hospital and then getting possibly a secondary Candida infection. So don't be too frightened to think that if you're reasonably healthy and you've had thrush or something that you're going to die, because that's not the case. 99.9% of cases of oral Candida or genital Candida or thrush can be resolved quite safely and without getting this invasive Candida infection, for example. So these are the key things to remember. Build a strong immune system, encourage a healthy gut flora. So if you've had antibiotics, have a good course of probiotics. Reduce the use of antibiotics wherever possible, and do good gut health and good gut cleansing and good anti-inflammatory herbal natural food products as much as you can, and you'll combat Candida quite powerfully. If you do have a chronic infestation, then next week what we're going to do is talk about I'll just stop screen sharing here for a moment. Next week we're going to talk about the herbs and the foods you can use to do your own herbal Candida program at home. So there's a lot of powerful foods and a lot of powerful herbs, and you can combine them all into what I call the ultimate herbal Candida program, where you get all of these things working together in synergy and you can wipe out Candida. And I've seen lots of cases of chronic Candida infestation be resolved using this program. So if you want to have a look at the barcode, the QR code in the corner, and you'll find it further down the page, but we will go into it in detail next week. So I look forward to talking to you again soon. Hope that's been helpful, and keep up the good work, you deep thinking herb lovers.